Hi, thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks everyone who's participating, and for those who woke up very early to listen to us. Yeah, I hope that my title says it all. It's really about securing the EU cobalt supply chain and having a positive impact. It's quite a summary of the current dilemmas that we hear, that we listen into the new EU regulations. It's really about the EU wants to show itself as the forefront of ESGs, being very strict regulations, making sure that we have a positive impact, but at the same time, that they want to be still a competitor in terms of industry and being to have in their own hands and to control their own energy transitions. And for that, they need a cobalt. So that's what my presentation is going to be about. But first, I'd like to, in 2 words, introduce EPIS. We are an NGO, but we see ourselves more as an independent research institute. We're based in Antwerp, in Belgium, and we've been working on business and human rights and conflict analysis in the Great Lake regions for, well, EPIS for 40 years, but myself for 8 years. And so now to come back on the cobalt in the DRC, it's going to be a very short snapshot to leave rooms after for the other things, but yeah, the cobalt earth and mining sector in DRC, it represents around 10% of the worldwide productions of cobalt. How we arrived to this number, we usually say that 70% of the Congolese cobalt production represents the worldwide production, and of this, 15% comes from the ASM production. That represents, according to the latest estimations that we have, it's between 150 and 200,000 workers working in the ASM cobalt production, and that's the livelihood of between 800,000 and 1 million people in DRC. So what are the challenges of those? And that in that snapshot, I want to speak about the challenge of this sector. And the first challenge is, of course, this is a very informal sector. So all the numbers I just gave are estimations because the miners are not registered, the production is not registered, the production is not traced, which means also that the purchases are not registered. So there is no tax, there is no money that the government can make on those production. Of course, there's been a lot of work to formalize the sector, and most of the initiatives and regulations and the new mining code in Congo are trying to formalize the sector, but so far the successes have been limited. And one of the things where it's limited, it's on the ZEA. The ZEA are zones specifically dedicated to artisanal miners. Unfortunately, they're not enough, and when they exist, they're usually not very productive. So there's very few miners going there, which means that in fact the artisanal miners worked on the concessions that are owned by large-scale miners, and that creates tense and sometimes violent cohabitations. When we talk about violence, we can mention in 2019 when the Congolese army chased away thousands of miners from the TFM mines. Same happened in Fungurume also in 2019. In Kisangala also, artisanal miners were chased away with weapons by large-scale miners. You can also have situations where it's the stalemate, where the large-scale miners knows that if they make a move, that will create a social unrest. We can, for example, mention the Shabara mine. Of course, it's not one-sided. You also have large-scale miners who complain about having artisanal miners on their mining sites, but they can't really chase away them, or they are victims of like sabotage, or material is destroyed, or simply they don't dare to go where the artisanal miners are because they want to avoid violence. But so because they don't have this specific place where they can work, that's also increased difficult working conditions. So basically the artisanal mining sector, it really means for it's miners going into under pits that can be, the law requires that it doesn't go under 30 meters deep, but of course it goes much deeper to that. And because it's informal, they don't take the time to secure their tunnels, and it becomes very dangerous. And then we can all speak about pit collapse, but it's also more smaller injuries, but like back pains are very occur very often. Breathing dust also occur very often. So as I was saying, in the last 20 years, we've been voting regulations, we've tried certifications, we've tried trustability systems. I'm going to speak about initiatives, but that englobes regulation, certification systems, traceability system. And so I'm saying the last 20 years because the very first time we really tried to formalize the artisanal mining was in the DRC mining code in 2002. And since then, we've had a lot of different initiatives, regulations, certifications. What's interesting to see is that between 2000 and 2015, we really talk about the 3T. It's more about the 3T. And it's really about a link that we make between the conflicts and the minerals. So that's the period when we speak about the conflict minerals, the blood diamonds, the blood minerals, and all the first initiatives. And the US Dodd-Frank, for example, translate that very narrative is we want to stop the funding of conflicts through the minerals. And then, so we had this narrative for around until 2012, 2013. And then by 2017, let's say, 2016, we start to have more a view on the cobalt because we start to speak more about the energy transitions. The Western world starts to notice that they actually need to control their supply chain that has been delocalized before. And then we talk about the cobalt. And the first things we talk about is about child labor and how we can mitigate those things. And so you have private initiatives that I mentioned here in 2018. You have the Mutoshi project. You have Cobalt for Development. In 2020, you have Fair Cobalt Alliance are coming in. EU is always a bit late. So in 2017, the first rules of the EU is the conflict mineral regulations that was voted in 2017 into force in 2021. But then what you have is really, first, it's really about the conflict, and then it's about energy transitions. And at the same time, the first laws that are about, I'm sorry, that's why you don't see it up. The first EU regulations now arriving in 2020, the first discussions are about how can we have strategies to secure our supply chain. And those new rules, and especially, for example, the EU battery regulation, it's really about how can we secure our supply chain and having a positive impact on the ground, or at least to mine responsibly. And so what were the results of those initiatives? Again, when I speak about initiatives, I'm including the regulations, the traceability systems, and the private initiatives. But the first thing is and it's pretty positive, it's that it shed lights on the conflict in Eastern Congo and the working conditions of the ASM in DRC. The second results that we have worked into and that we have researched is that there is no really incidence on the working conditions, unfortunately, and the salary of the miners has not increased. In fact, what we noticed when we deep dive into those research is that the miners don't have an incentive to be part of those initiatives. So they tend to stay independent and to work under their own conditions. And the third result of this is that this increased attention on ASM has really been about child labor, working conditions, and that has shadowed the misdeeds and the negative impact of the LSM cobalt sector. That can be destruction of the environment, the destruction of the fields, forced displacement, depletion and pollution of water. And what we can see is actually that those initiatives and regulations, mostly they try to solve issues that matters to the consumer and or in general, or to a general audience, but it doesn't speak to the local communities. When you go in the field, like the local communities, it's not that they don't really care about child labor, but they don't think it's one of the major problems. Their issues is really about the destruction of their field, the destruction of their crops, the health that are getting deteriorated due to pollution of water that brings skin issues and the forced displacement. And so another things that we could think is that those initiatives, first, the results were limited, but why this impact of these initiatives has been limited is specifically because a bit of what I've just said, we focus on the symptoms, just like child labor, but not on the disease. And one of the diseases, for example, could be the access to land. If you manage to have a better access to land for artisanal miners, you can actually solve the issues of what I was saying before, the violence between ASM and LSM. And you can actually improve the working conditions because they will have time to secure their pits. One of the other limits, or why has the impact has been limited, it's because those new EU regulations, they're simply not known. There's no concrete measures taken on the ground. I'm taking, for example, the example of the battery regulations that foresees a grievance mechanism for injured parties when your field has been destroyed, for example. But on the ground, nothing has happened. No one is aware of those things. And even, in fact, the EU Commission has not really worked on implementing concretely a grievance mechanism. So those laws are voted here, but they don't have a really an effect in the regions where the cobalt is extracted. As it's a bit similar to the results I was talking about, but the demonization of the ASM to the benefit of LSM is again shadowing the bad effects of the LSM. And so, but it has taken like a marketing views that, for example, you will hear companies saying like, oh, we will not buy from ASM horizontal mining because you have child labor, because of the poor working conditions. But we've never heard any company saying we will not buy from companies that have been convicted of corruptions, or we will not buy from companies that have been convicted of polluting the waters of local communities. And so, again, it's the impact has been quite limited also because we always have this humanitarian approach towards ASM, just to solve and to put bandages on wounds, but not to work with ASM as a business partnership. And that's a bit that's a bit what I was trying to think about. This is how can we improve this and to work with ASM as a real source of cobalt. So the idea is like, how would it be possible to actually invest in the ASM supply chain? And so I did like a quick SWOT analysis, and I'll be happy to speak about this with you afterwards. But it's really about securing a new supply chain of cobalt, which is exactly what I'm saying the EU, but that's precisely what every countries or powers wants to do today. But if you secure your own supply chain in the ASM, you can actually impose your own standards. And because EU wants to be the forefront of ESG standards, we can come up with our standards and integrated the inclusion of women, for example, or things like this. The strength also is that we have strong local partners. The government, the GCAMIN, are really willing to work with artisanal miners. And what I've written on the slide is a bit misleading. There's a high acceptance by local communities. At least there's a higher acceptance by local communities of ASM in comparison with the LSM sector. And so from those trends, you also have these opportunities. I was saying, if you give a clear spot and you formalize the sector, you can actually improve the relations between the ASM and LSM. And then you can have a positive impact on the livelihood of those local communities. About the strong local partners, that's also an opportunity because you can work with existing initiatives that are still working now. You have the Fair Cobalt Alliance, you have EGC, the Entreprise Générale du Congo, that has right now a monopoly, but it's not very clear if it's a monopoly or not. But they're working with the artisanal miners and they're trying to refine the production of the artisanal miners and to sell it in a formal way. And finally, you also have, as I was saying, those local strong partners. They really want to work the ASM. And lately, it was in February 2024, the GCAMIN has just given 5 concessions for ASMs, 5 ZEA, specifically dedicated to artisanal miners. Of course, I know it has weakness and threats, and it can be like it's a risky and it's a costly project. But you all work in the sector, so you all know that any project in the mining sector can be costly and risky. You can also find difficulties to find partners. It's not sure that LSM will give space for artisanal miners on their own concessions. And of course, there is a weak local governance. So I was saying before, yes, you have local strong partners that officially wants to work with you. But you will always have, the Congo is a complicated country in terms of governance, and you can also have people who will be against your project and you're not very aware of. And of course, the threats, we're talking about mining. There is financial risk, obviously, but you can also have reputational damages for the EU. If the project doesn't work and you end up with children on your minds, it can be, yeah, really damaging in terms of reputations, or you can be associated with bad partners. Unfortunately, many of the private sector that are working now in Congo have been convicted of corruptions or have been convicted or sued for child labor or things like this. So finding partners with a good reputations can also be difficult, but also his bad reputations can pain on the EU or the investor. And yeah, that was, I don't know how long I took to speak, but that was a bit the presentation I wanted to make, and I'll be happy to speak with you about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Fantastic. Round of applause, everybody. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I think we've got time for maybe one question, Guillaume, and that one has come in privately to me in the chat, and it asks about investment in ASM and normal stewardship rules with regards to that, and the complexity, I guess, with regards to money coming from elsewhere into the world of artisanal and small-scale mining. Do you have any comments with regards to that, or is it a case where we need to rethink stewardship or some of those rules that sit within all of that?
So what do you mean exactly by stewardship?
So I know that Ludovine will have thoughts on this as well. Maybe if the person who's asked the question wants to expand on it. But Ludovine, I know that this is something that's close to your heart. Do you want to expand?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that most companies or investors who could invest in ASM probably have rules. I think that's what stewardship refers to prohibit them from even trying to invest in ASM. And you were talking about this reputational risk. So the difficulty is that we need to find a way to let companies try to do this without penalizing their efforts if they go wrong. But at the same time, we need to make sure that they make all the best efforts so that they do source the right partners. So I presume the question was about how do we enable that kind of financing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of those, this is when you see that it's really human limits that we put to ourselves, because but the best way, I think, it's to find, and actually there was a Mutoshi project. It was funded by Trafigura and Shemaf that have worked with the ASM. And maybe one way would be that the money would go through actually the private sector and the LSM willing to work with. EGC is also a company that the Congolese state has put in place, and that the idea that they have is that it would channel all the artisanal production, and then they would sell it, and they would be formalized, and so they pay the taxes. So you could also work with EGC, but as I was saying, there is a weak governance in DRC, and that includes also for the EGC. So it's a huge problem, and I agree with this. But that's also, maybe you could also make, you could actually promote also the work that you do around the ASM and saying we're investing massive money. And the second and third, it might sound a bit like contradictory to what I was saying, by the fact that saying like we have to stop with this humanitarian view, but you can also work with the GIZ, you can work with Enabel, the Belgian corporations. Those can also channel money and having projects to work with actually artisanal miners, and then you can have those public-private sectors partnerships and investments.